Welcome to Grace Fellowship Baptist Church Wednesday evening Bible study for Wednesday, January 4th, 2023. We are in the book of 1 Samuel in chapter 27 tonight. Verse 1. But David thought to himself, one of these days I will be destroyed by the hand of Saul. The best thing I can do is escape to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will give up searching for me anywhere in Israel, and I will slip out of his hand. So David and the 600 men with him left and went over to Achish, the son of Maach, king of Gath. David and his men settled in Gath with Achish. Each man had his family with him, and David had his two wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail of Carmel, the widow of Nabal. When Saul was told that David had fled to Gath, he no longer searched for him. Now, if you remember in chapter 26, David had once again spared Saul's life, had taken the spear and the jug from beside his head while he slept at night. Saul had not been properly guarded. David is beginning to act like a commander, think like a commander. He was on not the offensive because he wasn't going to attack Saul, but he was definitely spying on him, doing reconnaissance, seeing how his camp was laid out, and he criticized Abner, son of Ner, the commander, because he didn't protect the king, he didn't post guard, etc., etc. David snuck in, stole the stuff, and got Saul to again promise not to hunt him down. Now, Saul, if you remember, has made this promise a bunch of times now and is still chasing David every once in a while. God has saved him many times, but David doesn't trust Saul. And he has no reason to. He has no reason to trust Saul's promise not to, even though he acknowledges in front of all his men and the army and everybody else, and everybody was witness to it. And they knew that David was going to be king eventually. But Saul is still their commander, still their king. You obey the king. They're stuck in a tough spot. They've got somebody who's not rational and not obeying God as their king, and they're really stuck for it. They know better, but they have to obey. And they're wrong if they don't obey Saul, and they're wrong if they do. And that's what you get when you have wrong leadership in political position. You cannot do the right thing. And so at the beginning of this passage, Saul, or the end of chapter before, Saul returned home and David stayed out in the wilderness. But he also decides, if I'm in Israel, Saul will continue chasing me and eventually he'll catch me if I stay too long. Now, he's tried going to the Philistines before, and they thought he was an enemy, spying them out. And in reality, he probably was, but not thinking he was, because he was just trying to escape Saul's hand. He's going to end up knowing about them somewhat, because he's lived among them. So he flees with his army. And notice he has 600 men, but everybody took their families with them. So, you know, if you assume one wife and 2.5 children, you've got a really big pile of people that David's leading. He's got his two wives. He's got 600 men with at least one wife, and some of them have children. And you've got a pile. He's not leading a little band of men around. He's leading a fair-sized city in that day and time, and the logistics of that, and he's keeping everybody fed and clothed and with something to do, and He's in charge and responsible for a bunch of people. God's been teaching him how to be king, and I keep pointing that out. There was no school for him for being a king. And God is organizing circumstances so that he learns politics, he learns logistics, he learns organizing men, all this reconnaissance, guarding the camp, etc., etc., etc. And I've been pointing out little things all along, and they're going to come to head now. He's going to start acting very kingly, and he's protecting his men, he's protecting himself, he's protecting their families, he's making sure Saul doesn't go after anybody else. And he goes to Gath. And let's pick it up in verse 5. Then David said to Achish, "If I have found favor in your eyes, let a place be assigned to me in one of the country towns, that I may live there. Why should your servant live in the royal city with you?" So on that day, Achish gave Ziklag, and it has belonged to the kings of Judah ever since. David lived in the Philistine territory a year and 4 months. So David goes in knowing that if he tries to stay in the capital, the political intrigue in Philistia, in Gath, is going to kill him. They're just as against him as Saul is, and have more reason to, because they're going to hate basically every Israelite, whether they're loyal to Saul or disloyal, or they have no reason to like him. And let's face it, he's killed Goliath from Gath. He's killed his tens of thousands of Philistine soldiers, some of which are going to have been from Gath. In fact, in one sense, 1/5 of all the Philistine population came from Gath, approximately. So, he's killed thousands of people from Gath. They have no reason to like him. They have no reason to think he defected from Saul. And so he begs to not live in the capital city, but to be given some little place out in the boonies, and he'll have his soldiers ready, and when they go to war, he'll be ready to go to war. But until then, we're just living out in the country doing farming and the things we've got to do to live, and paying taxes. And we're not soldiers for you, but we'll be part of the army when you need to raise a whole army. And so they live there a year and 4 months, enough that he can know that Saul's not chasing him, enough that he understands how the Philistines do things and observes how they do them. Let's face it, that's a whole year, a whole season. They've grown crops, they've put crops aside, they've done what civilians would do for a year and 4 months. Verse 8. Now David and his men went up and raided the Gershurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites. From ancient times, these people had lived in the land extending to Shur and Egypt. Whenever David attacked an area, he did not leave a man or woman alive, but took sheep and cattle, donkeys and camels, and clothes. Then he returned to Achish. So he's doing what armies in that day and time did. They raided other countries, other peoples, and stole things. And that was a major part of everybody's economy. But he's doing something a little different. Most of them, they came in, if they were going to steal sheep, they came in and rounded up the sheep and took the sheep off and only killed enough people to get the sheep out safely. He doesn't want it known what he's really doing, so he makes sure he leaves no survivors. Most raiding parties, they wanted to leave the people who actually made the products they were stealing alive to go, if they were stealing wheat, to grow more wheat, so that next year you can make another raiding party and steal their wheat again. If they were shepherds, you want to leave the shepherds alive so that next year you could go raid their sheep and steal more sheep. If you killed everybody, there's nobody to produce wheat. There's nobody to raise the sheep. And next year, there's not going to be somebody to raid. David's raiding people, but he's making sure there's no survivors to witness to what he's really doing. He's attacking Israel's enemies and stealing from them, and we're fixing to find out what he's telling Achish, the king. Verse 10, when Achish asked, where did you go raiding today? David said, against the Negev of Judah, or against the Negev of Jeharameel, or against the Negev of the Kenites. He did not leave a man or woman alive to be brought to Gath, for he thought, they might inform on us and say, this is what David did. And such was his practice as long as he lived in Philistine territory. Achish trusted David and said to himself, he has become so odious to his people, the Israelites, that he will be my servant forever. So David is going into these places, stealing booty, stealing from these people. But these were the enemies of Israel too. They probably were at least competitors with Philistines. The Philistines would not have minded too much him raiding those people. They had things to steal. But Achish thinks that David is attacking Judah and stealing from his own people, and therefore thinks that he's become so vile to the Israelites that they were going to be against him, and he has no place to be but Gath. And that therefore he's going to eventually integrate in Philistine territory, and because he's there, they'll at least get the good from him. Even if in war he gets totally wiped out, he and his men, he's brought them wealth in the meantime. Now, David and his men are actually the ones mainly getting wealth from this. And raiding parties like that very often get a lot of their wealth not directly from, here's a sheep and I own a sheep now and I'm wealthy, but I'll find somebody that wants the sheep more than I do and sell it to him for something I want more, whether it's gold or, grain or whatever, or, blacksmithing or whatever. And then they'll trade that away for what the warrior really needs. And David's probably buying agricultural products and things like that. But he's making fairly significant raids into other territory, and this is areas where there's lots of sheep and sheep raising, and they compete with Judah for that territory. This is next door to the Negev of Judah, and you noticed it was the Negev of these other places. It was the same region. It was pretty good shepherd pasturing area, and different people controlled different areas. And it was not all in one country's possession. And if somebody became more numerous, they'd push their borders out and push the other shepherds out. And that would, of course, create conflict, and there would be war. And so there's always been in that region a kind of nebulous border, uneasy truce, low-level warfare all the time, and shepherds getting killed. And, well, David's just emptied up a little bit. He's clearing out the area so that when he's king, his people can go be shepherds there. It's good shepherding territory. And he's not, he's stealing sheep, and that's what he's making his living with, but he's also clearing out Israel's competitors and Israel's enemies and letting Judah expand. And the people in Judah are going to know that. And they're going to know that there's fewer people competing with them in the Negev, and they can venture out further safer. And even if they don't know David's the cause, once David and his men get back, people are going to know. Because you can't keep those 600 men silent. And if 600 men are going on a raid, David can effectively wipe out everybody. He's doing what God told Moses to tell the people of Israel to do. This is part of the territory that God told Moses was Israelite territory. It's never been totally controlled by Israel before. And so David is going out and doing what God told him to do. Not directly, but necessarily. However, with the prophet Gad and the priest Abithiar, he may have actually been told by God to go do it. And he gets a city that is his, Ziklag. He was given it by the Philistines. They think they're giving him a city to keep him loyal. What they don't know is they gave him a city that now Judah, when he's king, is going to claim as their own. It's part of the territory again that God told Moses to possess, and that, Joshua told the people to possess. And so David is expanding Israelite territory while he's in Gath. At this point in time, Ziklag is in Gath territory. But it's actually not near Judah. It's kind of on the other side of Philistia. God was giving David a reason to expand Israel. Because he can't leave his little city that's his, given to him by the Gath king, out in the middle of enemy territory. He's got to have a land route to it. He's got to be able to build a road, get there, and get his stuff back out. And do it safely. So he's got to get enough territory all the way over there to possess his possession. And he's going to be able to do it in a Philistine court of law and saying, hey, it's mine. It was given to me. I've got to possess it. And, nobody's going to like it when he's king. But it's part of what is going to make him a successful king. He's now in the process of expanding Israel's borders. And he's doing so as a very good commander. We're going to keep hearing that he has 600 men. He's not losing anybody in battle. He's going out and making these raids, making these military, and not losing anybody. And they're getting very good at being soldiers and following his commands and surrounding an area and killing everybody in it, and then taking all the goods off. Normally, in that day and time, if you raided a community and say kill all the men, which is very common, you took all the women and children as slaves. David's not even doing that. He's doing what God told Moses and Joshua to do: leave none of the Canaanites alive. So he's being very obedient to God, and God's blessing him, and God's blessing Israel because he is still doing God's work. Now let's shift for a moment and start in chapter 28 and look at Saul and how he's doing. Verse 1. In those days, the Philistines gathered their forces to fight against Israel. Achish said to David, You must understand that you and your men will accompany me in the army. David said, Then you will see for yourself what your servant can do. Achish replied, Very well, I will make you my bodyguard for life. Now Samuel was dead, and all Israel had mourned for him and buried him in his own town in Ramah. Saul had expelled the mediums and spiritualists from the land. So there comes a time for war. And Achish says, I'm calling you up. I'm going to draft everybody in the service. And David says, of course, you're going to get to see how good a soldier I am. David's not bragging. He knows he's a good soldier. He's fought for Saul. He's fought independently. He's gone out and made all these military raids. And he knows he's effective. And he knows his men are effective. And he just says, you'll get to see how good we are. He promises that we will fight. Yes, I know. We are soldiers, and that's what we do. Sure, we've been farming for the last year and a third and making some raids to get some trade goods, but you'll get to see how good we are. And the two countries are fixing to go to war. They're raising their armies. And Saul has partially done what God had told him to do. Now, it says that Samuel had died. We'd seen that a couple of chapters ago. And everybody buried him. David had gone to the funeral, and then his men left. Saul had then tried to purify the religion in Israel and cast out all the spiritualists and mediums. Sometimes these people are called witches. They are people who practiced a religion that today we call magic. They claim that their spiritual power gave them ability to do things in this world that were miraculous, that they themselves were the miracle workers. And apparently Satan was giving at least some of them, if not all of them, some sort of spiritual powers that were beyond natural means. Satan can imitate spiritual things, and if you read the prophecies, the man of perdition is going to be able to do miracles and give people under him the authority to do miracles in his name, and his major people that are under him are going to do that. So Satan does have that ability to perform miraculous things. Moses told the people, if you see somebody doing a miracle, give them a test of the prophet. Are they telling you to worship Yahweh and worship Yahweh the way I told you to? Or are they introducing something new, something different? Are they telling you to worship another God, another way? Well, these spiritualists, these mediums, these witches, were telling the people to not worship Yahweh, to worship their gods and their idols and do things their way, and that you don't have to do it the Mosaic way, that you can do it a more interesting, easier, cheaper, more fun way. Because they wanted the authority and they wanted the power and they wanted to get the acclaim that God is due. Well, Saul had tried to clean up Israel, and he had persecuted this religion that was pervasive, apparently, and cast out everybody that practiced it openly as almost a priest of the religion. And he now needed somebody to tell him what God wanted him to do. Well, he no longer trusted the priest, and the priest no longer trusted him. Let's face it, he wiped out a priestly town at Nob. And, he's not obeyed God. He's not gone and performed sacrifices at Shiloh, at the tabernacle. He's not set up an altar and got priests to serve at it or anything like that. He's kind of ignored God for most of his reign. And the the last time he even gave a nod to trying to pretend that he was worshiping God was when Saul was criticizing him for not doing it correctly and not doing what Yahweh told him to do. And so, you know, he's lived his reign not practicing Yahweh worship. And now he needs to know what to do in this crisis of his lifetime. He's got this giant problem in his hand, and he can't consult the priest, and he has no prophets in his camp. And so he turns to the only other thing in Israel that can give him any spiritual answers. These spiritualists, these witches. Verse 4, the Philistines assembled and came and set up camp at Shunem, while Saul gathered all the Israelites and set up camp at Gilboa. When Saul saw the Philistine army, he was afraid. Terror filled his heart. He inquired of the Lord, but the Lord did not answer him by dreams of Urim or prophets. Saul said to his attendants, find me a woman who's a medium so that I may go and inquire of her. You know, God is not answering him in any way, shape, form, or fashion. Samuel was the last of God's people that God talked to that told Saul anything from God. God has abandoned Saul and left him to his own devices and been raising David up, giving David wisdom and skill and leadership in being a king, even though there's no school for kings. God is schooling David in how to be a king. And now we're coming to the crisis point. This is Saul's giant. And he is, like the first time he faced a giant, not really trusting God. He's consulting him as almost like he's going to consult this medium. He wants to know an answer. He wants to, you know, be able to put the coin in the slot and cha-ching, get out what he needs to know. He doesn't want to be obedient. He's not going to be obedient to the medium. He's just going to pay her wages, so to speak, and then leave. Which, for them, that was somewhat acceptable because it earned them a living. And that they used the spiritual forces that they really didn't control, but they used it to generate a living and make it look like they were more important than they really were, and they weren't, that they had a real God behind them and real authority, and that they could do things. And they claimed falsely that it was their power, not Satan's power working through them. And Satan let that lie stay because it got people to not worship God. It was okay for him. What's one lie? Satan was lying and saying he was God. Let his people lie again and say it was them and not him. You know, he didn't have to take the credit as long as he's messing up what God's doing. Middle of verse 7. There is one at Endor, they said. So Saul disguised himself, putting on other clothes, and at night he and 2 men went to the woman. Consult a spirit for me, he said, and bring up for me the one I name. But the woman said to him, surely you know that what Saul has done. He has cut off the mediums and spiritualists from the land. Why have you set a trap for my life to bring about my death? Saul swore to her by the Lord, as surely as the Lord lives, you will not be punished for this. Now, isn't that right? He's consulting somebody who works for Satan and making an oath on Yahweh's name to her that he's not going to harm her. Now, if I was the medium, I'd be like, didn't you just make an oath to the other God? I don't trust you. I mean, both of them are in a real pickle there. But apparently, it's just what you say to Saul. He doesn't really mean it to begin with, and it's just the form you use. You talk about everything as if Yahweh was the source, even when you're attending to somebody else that claiming to have another Yahweh, a source other than Yahweh. In one sense, all uh, the main view of most people was even the evil forces in the world got their power from God, from Yahweh. That God was the source of everything that happened, and particularly everything that's spiritual. And even if it was through a demon or a false god, it came from Yahweh. So the people would have been just casually swearing to Yahweh allegiance, and but not concerned about whether Yahweh would protect his name. They were casually using the name of Yahweh, not meaning it seriously. And that's in direct violation of the commandment to not take his name in vain. And Saul has just taken his name in vain there because he's not concerned about what God is going to say about him or to him, or he wouldn't have made the oath. Verse 11. Then the woman asked, "Whom shall I bring up for you?" "Bring up Samuel," he said. When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out at the top of her voice and said to Saul, "Why have you deceived me? You are Saul." Now, this is interesting. She does have the power to bring the ghost of Samuel back from Sheol, and when he gets there, she gets spiritual information with it that this man that's consulting with her and paid her is indeed Saul that was persecuting her, and that he just swore he won't turn her over to Saul, and she knows who he is even though he's in disguise, and it's night, it's hard to see, blah blah blah. She probably didn't know his voice. She's not been that familiar with him. It's not like they had radio or television and you had to be personally around somebody to know their voice. She's not been. She probably may not have seen him all that often, and the artwork and depiction of people was probably not that good that they didn't have photorealistic depictions of Saul, and the Israelites wouldn't have done a lot of that anyway. And so she doesn't know what he looks like real well. And with him disguised, very much the clothes made the man. If you wore kingly clothes, everybody assumed you were king. If you wore peasant clothes, everybody assumed you were peasant. And Saul's getting away with this charade of he and his men being dressed like they're not the leaders of the country. And he goes into her in that guise. But when she pulls up Samuel and his ghost is there, she also gets that information that the man that's consulting, that you're doing this for, is Saul. And she tells him off for that. So she is getting real spiritual information. And Saul comes back from the dead in a ghostly form, in an apparition, and Saul is going to be able to consult with him. Samuel is going to be able to consult. Saul is going to be able to consult with Samuel, and that's why he calls her up. Now she's willing to call up anybody, whether they worshipped Yahweh or somebody else, because that's what she does. She calls up the dead. It gives her authority. with people. Verse 13, the king said to her, "Don't be afraid. What do you see?" The woman said, "I see a spirit coming up out of the ground." "What does he look like?" He asked. "An old man wearing a robe is coming up," she said. Then Saul knew that it was Samuel, and he bowed down and prostrated himself with his face to the ground. So he gets confirmation that this is indeed Samuel come up from the grave as a ghostly form, and he worships Samuel like Samuel's God. Probably in his mind, Samuel is the last spiritual authority, even though he ignored Samuel his whole life, that he's had in his life. He doesn't really trust the priest. He thinks he's king and can order priests around and acts like he can order Yahweh and Yahweh's servants around. And to a certain extent, he's gotten away with that, being king. He hasn't let them do what they're supposed to do. He's assumed that the form that they got to follow means that God's going to be happy with them and accepting of him. But it's not the outward form that God cares about. God cares about the heart. And his heart's not right. That's why he's willing to call up Samuel. And now he's worshiping Samuel, which is, of course, wrong. Verse 15. Samuel said to Saul, "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" "I am in great distress," Saul said. "The Philistines are fighting against me, and God has turned away from me. He no longer answers me either by prophets or by dreams, so I've called on you to tell me what to do." Samuel said, "Why do you consult me now that the Lord has turned away from you and become your enemy? The Lord has done what he predicted through me. The Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hands and given it to one of your neighbors, to David, because you did not obey the Lord to carry out his fierce anger against the Amalekites. The Lord has done this to you today. The Lord will hand over both Israel and you to the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. The Lord will also hand over the army of Israel to the Philistines." So Samuel makes his last prophecy from the grave. He's been called up by the forces of evil, and he gives God's answer to Saul. That Saul indeed will die the next day in battle, and that his sons will die in battle, and the Israelite army will be decimated, destroyed, and the Philistines will win this great victory. Saul is rightly distressed. I think he has some inkling that things are not going well, that God's going against him, and that's why he wants this word, and he wants to learn what he should have done, because he's grasping at straws, trying to pull victory out of what looks like certain death and defeat. And indeed, God has ordained that he's going to die. And Samuel in Sheol knows that and tells Saul that. Samuel has nothing to lose. Saul cannot hurt him at all. And Samuel, being in Sheol, knows that because he knows God better. And he knows that Saul can do nothing to him. The worst thing Saul can do is just tell the priest, send him back, and he goes back to where he should be instead of back on earth where he shouldn't be. I mean, the worst Saul can do is send him back to God. Samuel don't care. Samuel is going to say God's words. He doesn't care what people think. He knows the spiritual forces. He's been on the other side. He's seen eternity, admittingly from a limited viewpoint from the land of the dead, place of the dead, Sheol. But He knows the spiritual reality better. And he knows what's fixing to happen to Saul. He's been dead for years now. And he tells it like it is. Verse 20. Immediately Saul fell full length on the ground, filled with fear because of Samuel's words. His strength was gone, for he had eaten nothing all that day and night. So basically, Saul faints. The people around him attribute it to him fasting. I think this is a spiritual condition. He knows the truth that his death is imminent. He doesn't have anywhere to hide, and his will to live, his strength, flees him momentarily. He doesn't get a chance to try. He's famished, but if you have a strength of will, you can still function very hard when you're fasting. I fasted for 5 days once, and I had a reason for it, and I had to do things, and I was going to school, and I was working, and I was ministering, and honestly, I was too busy to eat. So me deciding to fast for 5 days and spend that time in prayer relieved time for me. And since I was filled with purpose, I functioned quite well at a high energy rate for 5 days. If he's only fasted overnight in one day or one day in one night, it's not that big a deal. People do that all the time. I fast for over 24 hours once a week. That's just a health practice I have. I go to work. I work full time. I do what I do on that day just like any other day. Now, the people around me do know I fast. I don't make a big deal out of it. I don't talk about it all the time. There's another woman at work that fasts in a different schedule, and she and I have talked considerably about fasting and why we each chose what we chose and why, and she's doing it for health reasons also. He's in distress is why he's fasting. He's seeing how the army is and how the Philistine army is, and he is very afraid that he's fixing to lose this battle. And indeed he is. And not enough of the countries coming together to back him up to defeat the Philistines. The Philistines actually have a smaller country, fewer people, but more of them in the military. Saul has left more people farming and not recruited as much an army and not trained as many people, and he's meeting with a smaller army and one that is beginning to get dispirited. They don't necessarily trust Saul. Let's face it, he spent too much time chasing David and things like that, and being capricious and not ruling correctly. Because when you ignore God, you don't rule correctly. And we're feeling the effects of that in this country. Both parties are ignoring God and acting like they're in charge instead of God. And it's hurting us. And for the last probably 20 years, it's been really obvious. And it's getting worse every year. But, Saul's in distress. And he hears that he's going to die. And he knows deep in his heart it's true. He trusts Samuel. He trusts Samuel's word. And he was already thinking that that was likely. That's why he's trying to consult God and find out what to do and find out the right thing to do. Because he's in distress. And he hears it and knows it's the truth. And that distresses him a whole lot more, and so he faints. Verse 21. When the woman came to Saul and saw that he was greatly shaken, she said, "Look, your maidservant has obeyed you. I took my life in my hands and did what you told me to do. Now please listen to your servant and let me give you some food so you may eat and have the strength to go on your way." He refused and said, "I will not eat." But his men joined the woman in urging him, and he listened to them. He got up from the ground and sat on the couch. The woman had a fatted calf at the house, which she butchered at once. She took some flour, kneaded it, and baked bread without yeast. Then she set it before Saul and his men, and they ate. The same night they got up and left. So this woman has some real concern. Even though she views Saul as an enemy of her religion, and with reason, because he's been an enemy and she feels threatened by him, she also knows that Samuel told the truth, that he's fixing to die. She's not afraid of him anymore, but she is afraid for him. And she knows that if the Philistines come through, they worship a different God, and they would view her just as evilly as Saul has. And it's not going to be good for her. So she wants him to be in a good position to be king and lead the army. And so she urges him to eat enough that she kills the fat calf, and in the middle of the night kneads dough and bakes, it says unleavened bread. It was very similar to what we call tortillas. So she slaughters a calf, cooks it, makes tortillas, and feeds everybody. And she urges him to eat, but he says no. He's kind of in a suicidal spiral. But his men urge him to, and since he's used to consulting with them, he pays attention to them. And she feeds everybody, and they leave, still in the middle of the night. And this is going to set up chapter 29 and 30. And I'm going to stop here. David has established himself as a leader of a city, Ziklag. He's established himself as a military leader. They've been doing military raids. He's now fixing to go to war for the first time since he left the service of Saul a long time ago. He and his 600 men. Saul has finally come to his end of his rope. He breaks all the rules and even his own rules. And his men have just so used to him being out of control. They don't think anything about him breaking his own rules, much less God's rules. They're used to him being inconsistent. And he's been inconsistent. And now he's heard from Samuel again that God has removed the kingdom from out of his hands and given it to David, and that tomorrow, at that time, Saul and his sons are going to be in Sheol with Samuel. And Samuel knows that and tells him that, and he leaves to go back. What a sad end to Saul's life. If he had but only obeyed God, he could have been a great king. Not just the first king, but a great king. But he disobeyed God, and he doubled down, and he said, I did things right. And God said, I'm done with you. I will find a man that will be a man after my own heart. And he did. He found it in David. And David becomes the greatest Israelite king. His son Solomon got a lot of wisdom and glory and strength and did lots of things that people remember. But David is the one everybody wants to be the son of. I mean, let's face it, Jesus was recognized as the son of David. he was also a descendant of Solomon. He was a descendant of Rehoboam. He was a descendant of Hezekiah. He was a descendant of, you name all the Judea, Judean kings. And he was a descendant of all those guys. Nobody cared that he was a descendant, that Jesus was a descendant of those guys. Son of David. That's how important David was. David becomes to the Jews a character just like Moses was to them. Somebody who helped them organize who they are and their identity. And he's a man after God's own heart. That's how they become people that worship God. Holy Father, help us to be people like David after your own heart, that we're concerned about it. We'll do what you want us to do, no matter the circumstances. David was defending your country, your people, whether he was being chased by Saul or living outside the country. He was taking on the role he should have as king, even when it didn't look like it was going to be any profit to him. And he doesn't know at this point that he's fixing to get to be king very soon. He just knows that he's not going to break his promise. He made this promise to Achish, and he intends to fulfill it and be a warrior for the Philistines. Lord, thank you for protecting David. Thank you for bringing him through all kinds of circumstances, that he did not have to commit sin by killing anybody that was Israelite, not Nabal, not Israelite soldiers, not anybody. That he indeed obeyed you, obeyed your word, obeyed the commands that came through the priests and the prophets, the Urim and Thummim. Lord, you protected him, even in ways he didn't see. Lord, I appreciate that you protect your servants, that you guide them. Lord, we ask that you would direct our church and guide it. Have us to grow. Have us to obey you, to live for you, to do your will. That we would be telling people about you and your glory and your strength and good reasons for why they want to obey you. In your holy name, amen. This has been your host, Frank Reich, Associate Pastor of Family and Ministry at Grace Fellowship Baptist Church, and this has been the Wednesday evening Bible study for Wednesday, January 4th, 2023. This is recorded Sunday, January 1st, 2023, and we had a good worship service today. I like Oscar's sermon series he started, and I urge you to come to the Wednesday evening Bible study. Now, Wednesday, we will be seeing this video, and then Sunday, Oscar will be doing a good sermon series again. I also urge you to come to the evangelism training that they will have next Sunday evening. In this week, please pray for Frankie and I. We are going to be camping. We're going to be at a state park in Central Texas. We're going to have a lot of fun. I'm going to do a lot of hiking, a lot of exploring with the dogs. Frankie loves sitting in camp, and she has some things she's going to be doing in camp. So pray for us that we're being rested and relaxed and get a chance to unwind from what's been a very, very busy 2 or 3 months for us in the recent past. Work's been busy for me. Ministry's been busy. I'm doing things behind the scenes that I hope will help this video series. And I've been doing a lot of intense praying. And I think God's fixing to do some wonderful things in our church. faith that he is going to break out here in Fort Worth and do some amazing things. I want to see it happen. So come hear the Bible study and discuss it. Until I get to be with you again, have a blessed week.